All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. Actually, so we got 2 minutes in already, so we'll just go ahead and thanks for coming and go ahead and turn the time over to Cindy.
Okay, great. Thank you, Denise. Hey, hello and welcome, everybody. We're here this morning to talk a little bit about routes and driver pay, especially how they interact together, right? And if you integrate them as part of your holistic planning process, it really can increase your fleet performance overall. So let's talk right now a little bit about who's going to be speaking today. Myself, I'm Cindy Brand, the VP of Fleet Solutions at Descartes. I've spent much of my career as an evangelizer for the last mile technology. I've also been involved in product management, product marketing, and many go-to-market activities. Chris Dorian is a senior solutions consultant with me at Descartes. He has a very unique perspective as a former user of our applications. He spent more than 2 decades in logistics with responsibilities spanning branch operations and centralized routing. Next, we've got Scott Balthazar, who's the Executive Vice President of Transportation at BFC Software, one of our amazing partners that we work with at Descartes. He's been a logistics industry veteran with more than 4 decades of experience across warehouse operations, fleet management, and supply chain technology. And the fourth person joining us today is Ben Sampson. He's the head of solutions engineering at BFC Software. He brings over a decade of hands-on experience across warehouse operations, middle mile transportation, and final mile delivery. But he also brings with him a practical perspective on how planning decisions impact real-world execution. So to kick it off today, we'll really think about it. Fleets historically have dealt with a lot of siloed application, whether it's routing, telematics, maintenance, other strategic planning tools. These assets they're not talking to each other, right? Or to bring the data together, it's really difficult data gymnastics. And then we get into a second layer here. We've created another set of silos with the assets, vehicles, drivers, routes. We treat them all separately and don't look to see how do we integrate them together. We believe right now we finally hit a major inflection point in the industry. Why? Because drivers are more sophisticated. They demand equal attention. They want to become a more integral part of what we do today. And think about it. Drivers are important to us and they're also very expensive. That cost is about 12% of revenue. It can be up to 15% of your operating expense and even 60% of your total overall transportation expense. So as leaders, it's time for all of us to start to think more holistically across various time horizons. So the session today is going to walk us through how we can integrate strategic route planning, driver bid optimization, operational route planning, and load planning. We want to show you how all these things connect together to create better fleet performance. Remember, it's not just about optimizing the truck, it's about optimizing the systems that makes our truck move. So I want to talk with Scott for a little bit. Scott, you and I have been in the industry for a really long time. We've known each other for a really long time. I really think that you can't just have trucks anymore, right? You've got to think outside the box. Drivers are becoming more sophisticated. Traditional routing is a great foundation, but I feel like we're missing a little bit of some of the pieces. Where are we missing here?
Right. I think there are a couple of key spots that have traditionally been overlooked, right? You mentioned the connectivity between these systems. I think the idea that you've got a routing system that produces optimal routes, that's been around for a long time. You've
Yep.
got you've got drivers out there that are just dying to have some consistency. They don't want to be doing different things every day. They want to know week to week what they're doing. And the idea of bringing these kind of and then when they get out on the road, the trucks are loaded poorly. They don't have the product at the right spot. So there's kind of some downstream effect that comes from a great plan up front, but kind of gets messed up downstream. And I think that, we've got a couple things to talk about today. driver bid optimizer, which is building those driver packages, load planner at the end, which is kind of loading the trailers. And yes, there are definitely some opportunities for customers, to take a more holistic approach, like you mentioned.
Yeah, you said to me one time when we were just chatting, you said, you know what? We need to realize in our organizations that drivers are equal to fleet assets when it comes to financial weight. And that was really just an amazing statement to hear, and it's really stuck with me over time. Um, the other piece of this that I think we sometimes overlook as operators is the fact that the driver is also really a strategic asset, right? Plus, we've got a lot of interesting things that are happening in the market right now. We still have an aging workforce. There's a lot of pressure around retention. We also have digital natives now entering the workforce, which creates a lot of change, right? So we got to think about how are we going to do things differently. So when we think about the driver as a strategic asset, what are some of the things that drivers are actually looking for?
I haven't been an operator for the first 20 years of my career. They're looking for consistency. They want to make sure that they know what they're doing day to day, week to week. They want to make sure that they're not getting suboptimal preference, based off seniority, whatever. They want to make sure that things are fair. And we find that, driver optimization is key because, like you said, a lot of these guys are aging out. Um, uh, it's becoming harder and harder to fill those roles because they have to be specialized. They have to have, CDL credentials and, be able to pass a drug test, which, a lot of companies are finding it very difficult to replace those guys as they become, as the other guys start to age out. It's
Right,
definitely a
perfect.
balancing act.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we've talked about too is that, planning, when you start planning upstream or in that historical realm to create good standard or static routes, it does impact driver satisfaction downstream. That's why we need partners like you guys to understand how to transform some of that satisfaction piece. And then the other piece that's a gap is that strategic routing oftentimes doesn't really think about that driver allocation and bidding. And that's why I'm so excited today to have this conversation and show people a little bit about how all these tools can interact together. So I think we've got four big topics to talk about when it comes to kind of capabilities. Let's start at the beginning. I'm going to ask Chris Dorian to come on now and talk a little bit about strategic route planning, please.
All right. Thanks, Cindy. All right. So I'm going to take you through our strategic route planning tool, at a high level in terms of what we see it used for, typical use cases in different verticals and different industries. What you're seeing on the slide is a visual of that tool. We call it WinRoute. And you see on the slide, it says strategic single pass optimization, but really all that means is that, hey, you know what? We've seen some more traditional strategic route planning tools on the market. They're more multi-step, right? I load all my data in, I create territories, I do my weeks, my days. And then when I come to do the routing, I run into some violations in, capacity, time windows, different things. And it becomes a little bit more of an art project to stitch everything together to get all that stuff to work, right? So the planner, or the analyst is spending a lot of time massaging this data around to make the plan work. And I have used both styles. I've seen that case. It's very manual, very time consuming. So what WinRoute enables you to do organizationally is it becomes much more of an analytical tool, right? So it's more focused on data elements. So I'm going to load in all my warehouses, all the capacity constraints of the warehouse. Do I want to limit it by how many cases per day it can do? How many dock doors are in use simultaneously? And you load up your drivers, right? What days are these drivers available to work? What hours are they available to work? What start times do I want to model, right? So we can consider all of those things and even how many work hours in a week. So maybe I want them to run up to a 12-hour day, but I don't want them to run more than 50 hours a week. All those constraints, even on the vehicle. So we go in the vehicle now, we can capacitize it, in many ways. One, just in weight and volume in pallet positions, even into compartments. So it depends on, the fleet mix, how we want to do those different things on the vehicle, and even vehicle typing. So you get into specific requirements, say, hey, this customer needs a vehicle that's no longer than 28 feet or needs a vehicle with a tailgate. right? So we can match up vehicle to customer constraints. And we can also at the customer level say, okay, this customer is available from 6 to 11 in the morning, then not available again till 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. So really the focus is on getting the data loaded and the constraints set up in WinRoute so that when the planner hits the optimize button, WinRoute's going to look at all of the constraints, right? All of the variables that you've spent time setting up based on your historic order data that you've loaded in and plan that across whatever the time horizon is. It could be a 1 week, could be two, all the way out 8, 12 weeks, depends on what your replenishment frequency is. And then from there, you can get into doing things like, hey, you know what? I have my static or standard routes. I want to re-optimize them monthly, quarterly, biannually, even annually, right? It becomes just standard work for that analyst to go in and do. I'm going to import my data. I have my constraints all set up. I'm going to let it run. And then I can evaluate the solution to say, is this operationally going to be feasible in my organization? Is this something that can work? And you get different choices. You can also use this tool like if I'm in the middle of, I had just done a standard route reroute and I have new business I've gained, right? So I don't want to go through the whole change management exercise of redoing my standard routes again. I just want to fit the new business in so that it's a minimal change impact to the customer, to sales, to the drivers. I can just load those in and ask WinRoute, hey, looking at all of these routes that have got planned across X amount of days, weeks, not breaking any constraints, where do these fit? And then that allows you to kind of best fit them into the existing plan. Also, in terms of doing like rework, right? WinRow can run multiple scenarios at the same time. So if I want to model, hey, one scenario is 5 8-hour days versus I want to run another scenario of 4 10-hour days. I can set both of those things up and allow WinRoute to run it. And then I have both things I can compare and contrast the metrics on. Do I like the projected spend of the 5 8s versus the 4 10s? Is it more operationally reasonable or is it better fleet utilization? You can compare and contrast all of those different things because it can run both simultaneously. And then again, transitioning from that more artistry where I'm, back to the role, if I'm spending a lot of my time, like I was speaking about at the beginning of managing, hey, these were all in violation. Now I have to move days and weeks versus I've set up my constraints and now I'm really, sitting up above the problem at an analytical level, evaluating do I like A, B, or C solution for different reasons, and can I operationalize them? And that's the power of what WinRoute gives you. Next slide. So part of the setup is we all have customers that get serviced differently, right? So we have customers that maybe once a week, customers that maybe up to 5 times a week. We have what we call a flexible frequency. So instead of being very prescriptive, right, of saying, hey, this group of customers or this customer is Monday, Thursday, or Tuesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Saturday, and being very rote based about it, we can tell WinRoute, this group of customers or this customer has to be serviced twice a week. But I what I'm telling WinRoute to do is say, hey, I don't want it to be any closer than 2 days in between days of service, but not more than 3 days. And then what it'll do is it's going to pick the best 2 day combination across my planning horizon to give you the best density. So you get the best logistics solve by allowing our optimizer to pick your best day combination. And then this is a visualization of, like I said, we're, a lot of us in the industry have been accustomed to seeing the territory based where you have these polygonal lines hardly drawn, in a geography to separate things out. We're showing here is you can achieve very similar groupings to create consistency for the driver, right? Because I know Chris is always going to be in the northeast of the city, different parts of the northeast, but generally speaking, I know where I'm going to be driving every day, 5 days a week. You can create across the whole planning session with more dynamic I call them dynamic territories, but essentially what it is WinRoute will build geographically contiguous density once it starts its planning. So if I get assigned to that northeast area, in the top right of that visualization, as it's planning out across the day, the week, the month, it's going to make sure that I'm staying in there. So once it assigns the asset, it's going to cluster them into dense clusters. And what this gives you the advantage over, more of a traditional territory approach is you're going to get some sharing on the boundary lines where it might make more sense from a miles and time perspective to have Chris cross over into Cindy's area, if I'm in a more metro area and it's dense. WinRoute also takes advantage of very detailed historic mapping data. So, when we're planning in a vacuum, if you're not using map data that models the real world constraints of the pathing, so hey, I might start a route at 6 in the morning and I'm going south on, whatever interstate. If the posted road speed is 60 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, and your application isn't using the historic speed degradation, you're going to be overly optimistically planned for that route because it's going to take that posted speed limit. What we do instead is, and you can see in the top and the bottom graph, the red line and the blue line is by direction of road travel, right? By hour of day, how much are we degrading the speed based on historic congestion? So in the bottom, you can see the blue line dips from 8 in the morning to 10 at night. What it's telling WinRoute is, hey, that road might be 50 miles an hour. But from this time, 8 to 10, it's really only driving at 50% of that speed. So when you're building your routes, they become much more operationally feasible because you're taking into account the real world driving conditions while you're building your new static plan. And in that first slide, there is a blurb that said we have over 200 business rules in Monroe, which is true. And they're all aimed to do slightly different things. This is just an example of saying, look, I have a group of customers that are very high touch. I need to make sure they're always serviced first thing in the morning, or else, sales starts getting phone calls. We can set up a property or a feature on data of gold, silver, bronze. And then I can use the pre-built rules in WinRoute, no customization needed, to say, hey, no matter where you're planning this customer or this order for this customer, they always must be first in the route. And that way, you're slowly, and what I've been trying to illustrate is you're slowly transitioning a lot of that tribal knowledge that's existed at the planner level, doing more of, the art and science into more of a scientific approach, because we're housing the variables that have been captured in that person's head over years of doing it into a systematized way. And strategic planning, so really what you're trying to do is give your operational folks, the people that have to turn this into what I'm doing tomorrow, the best chance at that being reasonable. So you always want to look at reduction in miles and hours and assets, right? But really what you're trying to do is create something that's operationally very accurate, and that'll increase your ability to hit your service level agreements as well. But it's all about making sure that all of the data in and the algorithmic constraints that get applied during that optimization give you the best chance at having something that's operationally feasible.
Thanks, Chris. I'm gonna jump in here. So as Chris explained, strategic routing is important, right? It gives you some framework to build your operation around. But that's not really, in the old days, that was pretty much where it ended, right? Now we're going to take into consideration the driver criteria, right? The fact that you have drivers that they want schedules that they can rely on, and that are fairly allocated across all the driving fleet. Um, so let's talk a little bit more about that. So the next slide is going to show that that the strategic routing on the left-hand side of the screen, right? That's basically saying we've got customer constraints, we have order volumes, we have service two days per week, 3 days per week, so that's done a great job of figuring out what the actual route should consist of. The right-hand side talks a little bit more about what we call driver bid optimizer, which is trying to balance the assets, trying to make sure that you know how many drivers you need based off how many bid packages that get created from that set of static routes or master routes. Um, Driver Bid Optimizer has a lot of capability as far as trying to level the amount of hours. So try to hit between 40 and 50 hours for each driver. Um, a certain pay rate, $1,200 to $1,500, however your pay is structured. Making sure that you don't work more than 5 shift days, if that's your rule. Make sure that you have 10 hours off between routes to meet the DOT criteria, things like that. Um, if you're doing double dispatches in a day, make sure that you have you have 30 minutes off between redispatching this another short route, but not more than 2 or 3 hours. So you might not want a guy sitting around 4 hours to wait for the next route. So a lot of those things are kind of automatically built into the algorithm based off your inputs. It's you set the rules, the algorithm then goes through the optimization process, does all these calculations that you can't do in your own head, and comes up with a set of bid packages. So why does the next slide says, why does that matter? Cindy hit on this already. I'm going to repeat it because it's important. Drivers, 12 somewhere in the 12% of total revenue, right? The operating expenses probably 50%. And, from your transportation standpoint, it's a huge expense for the driver. So making sure that they're being allocated correctly, it has a direct reflection on the bottom line. So what are some of the things that I mentioned, from the configurable engine? Like I said, days off. Make sure you have a 2-day weekend, even if it's not Saturday, Sunday, a 48-hour period where the driver's off. If you want to have a skip day in the middle of the week, that kind of, you could say, you could work at Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and have off Wednesday, and then have off Saturday, Sunday. Those kind of configuration parameters are out there for you to use at your discretion. The algorithm itself, I think, having done this a lot in my early career, you're only doing slightly better generally bidding than you did the last time. So you take what you did before, you get a new customer that drops, you get a new customer that gets added in, and you're trying to figure out what's different and making enough changes that makes it operationally feasible. But it was never really optimized. And the driver bid optimizer we created does that, and it does it very quickly. It does it systematically. You can then have the driver, share that with the drivers so they can, either you pick the bid packages for the drivers or they pick it themselves. But somehow or another, you come collaborate with the driver to make sure that they feel like they're being treated fairly. Um, it would be very easy to do simulations. So let's say you're picking up a new account that, has 10 new stores, or let's say they pick up an account that has 2 new stores. Well, maybe that doesn't screw up the plan quite as much as if you got a 20 account chain that gets added into your system. In between creating bid packages that you execute, for the next 3 months, 6 months, or whatever, you could also do a little sandbox simulation that says, hey, if I get these customers, you could create a new set of master routes in Descartes, send them into Bid Optimizer, and say, okay, now what does this do? Oh, I see. I can kind of fit some of those stops in, but I'm still going to need to hire 10 more drivers or 12 more drivers. Generally, that means you're going to have to increase equipment, which is very expensive. You don't want to guess on how many tractors to buy. So an optimizer like this would allow you to have some kind of intelligent decisions on both how many new drivers you would need in that simulation and how many tractors. And we do have a built-in integration with Descartes that allow you to bring in those master routes into Driver Bid Optimizer to very quickly get the information from Descartes into Optimizer, come up with those bid packages that you can then execute. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben from here. He's going to talk a little bit more about how the data flows and all that stuff, and then Ben, you're up.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Perfect. Yeah. So just wanted to walk through the flow a little bit and how these systems work together. So as you'll see on the far left, taking that strategic route planning that Chris had just gone into, really deciding what routes, when those routes are running. We also have the option to add non-routed work. And so the core routed work sometimes isn't 100% of the work drivers are doing. There's backhauls, there's shuttle runs, there's vacation time, whatever it might be. We're able to take that into consideration as well. We're basically taking those two files, those then come into BFC driver bid optimizer. And so we're getting a list, as mentioned, it can be 8 weeks of data and routes, it can be 6 months, whatever it might be. We then run that against the constraints that Scott had mentioned, and we'll show in some of the following slides as well. That's taking into consideration the workforce that you actually have, the drivers that you have. Do they have Sundays off? Are they working mornings? Are they working nights? Whatever that might be, and is able to put together a driver bid package. And so that driver bid package is really that clean, actionable, what is driver A going to be doing? And so it's very clear. And so really just Descartes is kind of deciding the what and the when. BFC can really help you decide the who. And so if we go into the next slide, I'll show a little bit of the flow. So um, at the top, this is that initial input. And so that's that master route plan. And so you'll see it's a long list of routes for a certain amount of time, the trailer, the day, the hours, all of that information that we're getting from Descartes. And if you note the sorry if we can go back one more. If you note the blank box that's in there, it'll make sense. That's where the driver bid package actually gets populated once it goes through. And then you'll see on the bottom, we're running that against the optimization parameters. And so you'll see some of the things around there that's around, target pay for a driver bid package, total hours, maximum shifts, minimum. Do you want people to work 6 days? Do you want them to work 4 days? All of those things that you're setting. And a big part of that, once it runs through the engine, as guys mentioned, it's fair and it's even. And so it's not a human that's deciding, well, let's give this route to this person and this route to this person. It's taking those considerations, optimizing it, and really trying to make it fair across people. And so again, taking that very raw data of what are my total routes for this time frame, running it against the constraints. And then if we jump to the next slide, this is essentially the output. And so two things on here. So at the very top, it's the bid package summary. And so this is a visual. It's multiple different warehouses, distribution centers. It's able to run across multiple. And so where you'll see the averages, I have 52 packages for Texas. I have 3 packages for Arkansas. You can see average miles, average time, total distance, driver pay, and so can get a view of that. And then at the bottom is really that actionable bid package. And so, as I mentioned, if you saw the visual on the slide before, it's a long list of hundreds of routes. This really puts it together. You'll see, bid package 1. These are the 5 routes that you have. These are the routes that make sense for you and have been optimized. That's what a specific driver would be getting. Here are my 5 routes for this duration. I understand my start time and my end time. And so really it becomes more tangible and actionable throughout there. And so that's what that output looks like and what we're doing with the great routing data we're getting from Descartes. And then if you jump to the next slide, it's another kind of output. And so it's a similar data as the slide that you saw before, put some of it in a different view, but it's also filterable. And so you can go in here, you want to filter to a specific time frame, you want to filter specific packages. I want to look at my AM routes versus PM routes. You can really get a view in there. And then there's also drag and drop functionality. And so, with an optimization engine like this, it's great to run something and get an optimal output. There's also a human element to this, and there might be tweaks and changes. And so you are able to drag and drop things around and understand what that would impact. And so if I want to shift some routes around, I want to make some changes, is that going to change my average pay? Does somebody now not have enough rest time? And so it allows you to make those changes, but still is taking into consideration the constraints and ensuring, that people are following what's needed within there. So, yeah, so that's really kind of how the two systems work together. And so I think there should be a poll that is popping up shortly or has already. And so I'd love for folks to take a chance and answer that. And in the meantime, I'm going to transition it back to Cindy and Scott to discuss a little bit of what we've just reviewed.
Thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate that. What's so apparent to me as I kind of watch, the strategic planning piece come into play with the bid optimizer is that strategic planning is really focused on building that efficient route, putting the density on, making sure that it's runnable and full, right? And then the bid optimizer is making sure that it's fair when we're looking at it from a driver lens, if you will. And I think that one of the things that this really emphasizes is the fact that you are creating predictability for the drivers, and that ultimately then leads to retention. People just want to know what they're going to do every day, number one. And number two, they want to make sure that it's fair across, from driver A to driver B. I think that if they have these predictable lanes, it really gets rid of a lot of the chaos that exists around assignment. Joe got a route that was better last week, so we got to give it to Jack this week. A lot of different things like that. Scott, how would you say that this really kind of links into food service distribution?
Yeah, one of the things that Ben didn't mention, which is part of the input, or he did kind of mention this, but you could not only can you input things like backhaul schedules and deadheading and things like that for that maybe aren't part of the master routes. You can also bring in dummy routes like vacation replacement drivers. You could say, hey, I need a vacation replacement driver from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. That guy might not know what he's going to do, but he's going to take over one of the guys that does have a permanent bid schedule. And so it builds that bid package, with vacation replacements. And he might do vacation replacements Monday and Tuesday and then have a route Wednesday. And, so it gives that holistic look, where it's not just the master routes, it's all that the extra work that happens on a daily basis. Um, you know, it that's not an exact science because things come up on the fly, but this is giving you a much better, much better way to mousetrap to fight that stuff that
Mhm.
is not somewhat predictable. And now you're only dealing with the outliers instead of, only having the master routes and everything's an outlier at that point.
Yeah. So the key theme I think I'm hearing through this whole thing is really about stabilization, right?
Right.
Creating stable route plans, creating these stable driver packages so that, again, repeatability, predictability, consistency, really important there. So we've talked about creating the strategic plan. We've talked about optimizing the driver bid packages. Now let's go throw it back to Chris and talk about um, how do we move past strategic and bidding into that daily execution layer now?
All right, thanks, Cindy. So now that we've, spent time engineering out that standard route and doing our driver bid packages, we've got to throw it into the wild world of daily route planning. So our daily route planning tool, we can take feeds from, of course, WinRoute. So we've spent all that time. We want to send the data from WinRoute to live in our daily tool so we can, apply the standard routes as we receive orders from your ERP. We see some customers going in a hybrid where their standard routes are, hey, I really just want to make sure that my high volume, my high touch customers are pegged to these standard routes. And I want to let the rest of the customers filter in and use the optimizer to find, best fit, best route for the day of planning. Um, and not so much in the current condition, but we see it a little bit is dynamic planning where, hey, I just going to allow my orders to filter in from my ERP batch or drip, however you want to feed them in. And then I've got my constraints set up in my daily tool, like how many vehicles I have available, how many hours I want them to work, and allow the optimizer to build the best plan today for tomorrow, today for 2 or 3 days out. Depends on your order taking timeline. Our daily planning tool utilizes much the same underpinnings, right? So we also, now that we're planning today for tomorrow, we want to make sure that, hey, the pathing that I'm saying I have a route that goes A to B to C to D, I want to make sure that the roads that it's driving this truck on are commercially viable, right? I don't want any roads that have low bridges or have weight restrictions. And if I have hazmat requirements, I also want the optimizer to understand that, and it does. It's using commercial roads under the scene, same as you're doing when you're planning those in WinRoute. It also supports the multiple times per day. So again, I can arrive between 6 and 11, 2 and 5. One thing we also do, because we understand that that daily planner's day is highly dynamic, we're integrated to be able to bring in hours of service. So we can visibly show the planner, hey, if I'm going to assign Chris to a route on Thursday, how many hours does Chris have left? So there's some element of reality. They're not having to go out to their other telematics system or ELD provider and run an hours of service report. There's some visual availability for the planner there. And then you can have different restrictions. So if I'm in a more conventional setup, I have my standard routes in daily planning. I load the orders, I apply my standard routes. I might have some routes that are, blown out capacity. I have this store ordered more cases this week, or the other, this store didn't order as many. So now I have to either manually move stops around, swap them between, Chris and Scott and Cindy, or I can have the optimizer with some constraints on it, move things around. One of the ways the optimizer can do that is, hey, I want to keep all of my standard routes the same, but I want to swap the things that are pushing maybe the capacity or the time around to try and even out the work a little bit, right? I don't want to have someone manually click through 100 routes and try and do that. It's very time consuming. Plus, the optimizer is going to give you a better solve, right? It can do the math better than we can do it visually. So you can also have restrictions on that, right? I don't want to, regardless of my hours, I'm working a 10-hour day, but you know what? I don't want them to have more than 10 customers on the route. That's my upper limit. You can put that limit in the optimizer. And then again, similar to how we constrained the vehicles in the WinRoute setup, we're going to tell it this much cube, this much weight, as many pallet positions. This is a truck that has a tailgate. This is a 28-foot truck that can fit in this parking lot. All of those things are still applicable when you're using the optimizer in the daily planning tool. The other thing is in terms of cost. So I want to give my planners some visual indication if I'm moving things, right? I want to move it from Chris. I want to move it to Cindy. If I have a vehicle profile and a driver profile set up with my, vehicle cost per mile and my driver cost per hour, or however we're remunerating. When I do those things in the tool, there's a cost column that's going to show you the projected cost. And it'll tell you if you're shuffling things around in tiles in the application, what impact that had. So did I cost miles? Did I cost time? So it gives the planner feedback as they're making manual decisions. The other thing it gives you is if I'm managing a group of planners, right, and I want to have some kind of level of empirical data to say, how are they doing, right? They're creating route plans for warehouses in different geographies, across the country. But I want to know, or I want to have a level of confidence as their manager that they're doing the right thing, both for the business and for their end customer, which is the warehouse. So we also have built in what we call planner plan versus optimizer plan. And what that allows you to do is schedule it to run, say, overnight. And, we could run every day. And then what it'll do is take, okay, Chris planned for this warehouse for tomorrow, 13 trucks, 1,000 miles, and X amount of hours. It will then, using your optimization profile, optimize it and show you the difference in fleet used, miles, and time. And again, it's meant as more of a coaching mechanism so that you have some level of empirical measurement on how your planners are utilizing the tool. So once it's out in execution, right? I've built my routes now that it's the day of. So Thursday, March 5th, I have my fleet out on the road doing the, deliveries, the pickups, the planned work. You get to see that inside the tool. So you can see the truck, you can see where it is, where it's been from GPS ping perspective, right? And then you get in real time the ETAs to know, am I ahead? Am I behind? Or might I be in danger of missing a time window? Do I have to shuffle things around on the road so that I'm going to make sure I get to all my deliveries, right? The other things it gives you is on the empirical side, it gives you a chance to contrast your plan versus what your actual was. So I planned this route for 150 miles, but Chris, you ran it at 175. Maybe there's data elements that are causing the difference, right? Or maybe Chris just needs to follow the route and the sequence that he should have followed it in, and it's a coachable moment. The other thing is, as we're collecting data, right, we're going to go to the same stores over time, multiple times. We can learn through machine learning how long we should be taking at each store. And then that is a feedback loop back into your planning that creates this cycle of continuous improvement from standard route creation back down to daily route creation. And you'll see in the next slide that if I'm managing, a small, medium, or even a large fleet, and I want to have some kind of like command and control center to show me, hey, how am I guys doing out there? How's the fleet doing in terms of the plan? I put up this Gantt chart, and we've seen it utilized on a dedicated monitor in a dispatch office, for instance. Hey, who's ahead? Who's behind? Who's on break? Where might I have to move stops around? And you can see on the slide, it's showing, okay, I've got some drivers that are behind, some drivers that are going to be late. Do I need to move stuff around? And again, it just gives you a central spot to keep your eyes on your operations while it's running.
Great, thanks, Chris. I'm gonna jump back in here and um, so now you've got the master plan, you've got the driver bid schedules, you've got the daily plan based off the order volumes that are coming in, day to day. So now let's look at the truck itself, loading the truck. How do you make the outcome of how the routes are planned, fit into the driver's life, which is making the deliveries out on the road. Um, So the next slide is going to kind of give you that kind of wheel look again that we talked about. So load planner, it's been around for a long time. We've have, lots of customers out there using this where we have our strong, our sweet spot, especially on the food service side, is, multi-stop, multi-temperatures, right? Frozen in the front, cooler in the middle, dry on the tail. Side doors. Side door could be on the left side, it could be on the driver's side. So where are those doors placed? And that reflects how the load planner is going to build the route. So if you go to a store that has a side door delivery at stop one, the driver hopes to open the side door and find stop one there, not stop nine. So multi-stop, multi-temperature, um, lots of different kinds of, full pallet, half pallet kind of operations out there. We can do kind of axle weight balancing if that's your thing to try to make sure that even though you don't exceed the gross, you don't exceed any of the axle limitations when you hit the scale houses. You want to try to make a route or a load plan that's efficient for the driver, but also efficient from the warehouse side. You don't want to have robbing Peter to pay Paul, where you've got a bunch of small pallets that make extra passes through the warehouse just to make the driver's life better. So it's that kind of blend of best of both worlds. There are lots of rules, kind of like driver bid optimizer, a lot of things you can kind of configure in low planner to kind of say, hey, don't make more than 70 cube pallets in the freezer, but you can only have 65 cube pallets in the dairy in the cooler section, and you can have 80 cube pallets in the dry because that's easier to stack. So lots of configurability when you're building out load maps. You've got the controls at your own hands. The next slide is going to talk a little bit about, why it matters, reduction in load planner time. So you don't have guys sitting in the office for 8 hours doing 100 maps, maps for 100 trucks. You're going to significantly drive that time down. Theoretically, if you have a better plan that the loader now he knows what the selector did, he's going to have an easier time finding pallets, getting them loaded rather than searching around thinking, oh, where do I put this? What's the right spot for these two pallets to be consolidated? Um, you can see there for yourself, there's a number of things. Um, the drivers are going to be happier because you've got that consistency. They have a map and they know that where things are, and it's not sloppily written. Handwriting. There aren't pallets that gets missed. It's on the truck, but it gets missed being put on the map itself. It's going to do it systematically for you every time, and it's going to follow your rules. It's not going to break the rules that you've decided that you have loaded into the system. Um, I think the next slide, we're going to switch it back over to Ben to give you a little bit of, kind of the same thing we did with Driver Optimizer. What's the workflow to get the, the load planner to work? Ben, you might be muted. Uh-oh, that just me or?
I think we lost your audio, Ben.
How about now?
Yeah,
There.
we're good.
All right. Awesome. Sorry about that. Yeah, so as mentioned, going to walk through the flow here. Again, we're going to take what Chris had talked about, the operational route planning, what those routes are, combine that with what we call kind of routed sales order that has some of that four walls data with more information around, what items and information around it, what slots are they going to actually be selected from, and then that's coming into load planner. And so once that comes into load planner, we run that against a lot of those variables that Scott had just mentioned. Understanding, is there a side door? Is there a tail door? Or do you allow multiple stops on a pallet or not? And so really getting an understanding of where that product's going to be going on the truck. The goal is really you want to be picking product, the way you're going to load the product, and then the way you're going to deliver the product. And so balance across that. You're not picking in one way, then you have to rebuild those pallets to load them a different way. And then on the road, a driver's fumbling through the pallets because they're delivering them a different way. And so it's really creating that optimized pallet and plan there. And then there's two outputs that come from there. And so the top one you'll see there on the far right is typically this is feeding a selection tool. And so where we're saying this is what the pallet should look like and where it's going to be loaded, then it's actually how do you go and get that selected? Then once that's selected, how are you actually loading it? So we say these are your 20 pallets. Those 20 pallets are now on the dock. How do those get loaded? What goes where to follow some of that? And so that's the flow throughout. Um, if we can jump to the next slide, and some of these will be somewhat quick, but essentially, again, this is that raw data import that's coming in, routed sales orders. It's a list of this is truck one. These are my 12 stops that are on it. These are my 600 cases. What we're then doing is figuring out where those 600 cases should be going. And so you'll see this load plan diagram. And so this is meant to be really a visual representation of the truck, and it's following a lot of those rules that we had put in place. And so it's knowing what stops are going where, what cases are on what pallet. And it's, again, especially within the food distribution, we're not always able to just load, everything in stop order. You have to have frozen product in a frozen compartment. And so we'll walk through a couple of the things that you'll see on here. So one of the big things is that product type split. And so you'll see the kind of blue bars, that's your frozen pallets, and that's what's in there. Green is going to be your dry pallets. Yellow is going to be refrigerated pallets. And so where the optimizer is understanding how you want the truck to be loaded and splitting some of those out. There's also non-product loading information that's part of this. And so where you'll see the green bars that go around, you'll see kind of on the bottom left, that might be a bulkhead door. And so it's understanding where that is. The black bar at the very bottom, that's the door on the truck for a tail. The blue bar on the right side in the middle, that's your side door. And so, and then the red bar at the very top, that could be a load bar that you want to put in to secure that pallet. And so it's very clear to the loader when they have all of these pallets, they know what pallet should go in the nose of the trailer and be the first one. At what point do I, have the bulkhead? At what point am I going to put a load bar in if you want to understand and share some of that? Some of the kind of, there's a big part of this that's visual that you can see there that we had just talked about. There's also part of this that takes place in the back. And so that's around max cube per pallet. And so once a pallet gets up to 60 cube, if that's what you have it set, it's going to flow into the next. Understanding what Scott had mentioned, what door do you want to unload out of? So if you're opening up that side door, stop one's there, not stop nine. And so really understanding that optimization, and then it really can be a value add for the driver. And so where they know where everything is, you'll see across all these pallets. If I start on the bottom left, stop one and two for frozen is on that pallet. The driver knows stop one is on that pallet for frozen. They know where stop one is for dry. They really know where everything is on the truck. Um, and so makes it easy for them. Again, as I mentioned, can't always just have first pallet stop one, second pallets all of stop two, third pallets all of stop three. And so it gives a clear visual when it's there. And then the last thing at the bottom is you'll see the weight balancing that we talked about. And so, it's really taking into consideration how to optimize across selectors, loaders, drivers, and making that efficient, but then ensures it's a balanced trailer as well and make sure that you can stay compliant. And so it really does a great job optimizing across all of those. And so again, really wanted to show kind of what that connection point is between the two is we're getting what that finalized route should look like, and then BFC is providing how you actually load that, how do you actually go select that. So I'm going to pass it back to Cindy and Scott now to talk a little bit more about each of these companies and how we work together to bring value to you all, hopefully.
Thanks, Ben. So to bring this home, just a couple more minutes to go. You know, it's really apparent to me that the departments are clearly interdependent upon each other. And then second, you have to strive for this end-to-end efficiency point. You have to have real discipline around, your execution. And now when I say execution, it's not just what's happening in real time, it's everything from the strategic planning through load optimization. It will significantly improve your operating ratios. But Scott, for you and I, real quick, I think I'm going to pick out like three things that integrated planning is really important for me, and then I'll ask you for three things. I always lean back on financial stuff. So for me, I'm going to say that it's all about operating ratios, and those are really important because those are the numbers that the CFOs are looking at. Also, I live for on time, order in full, right? So making sure you got the right delivery to the right place with the right information. And then, the third one for me is really about, being super efficient with your headcount. Not get rid of people, not streamline, but do you have the right people in the right jobs? And if I can be more efficient in one spot, that means I can free somebody else up to do something in another spot. What are your three favorite things?
Yeah, I think you hit it right. You hit the nail on the head. I think having that information come from the routing system into BFC is key. So we make sure that the drivers get fairly assigned bid packages, right? That those bid packages have some kind of logic behind how they were constructed. The next piece then would be, after the daily routing is done and the low maps come out, that the maps are consistent. They're the same every time. If you put chemicals on the tail, the chemicals are always on the tail. If you put stop one at the side door, always stop one's going to be at the side door.
Sure.
So from an operational efficiency inside the four walls of the warehouse, that's key, right? The selectors and the loaders know what to do. And then on the back end, now you've got the drivers that are just loving this because they don't have this guessing game of I'm at stop one, and am I going to open the door and find stop nine? So driver satisfaction gets driven, from this whole, end-to-end process at this point. Perfect routing scenario up front, all the way out to the driver at that point.
Yeah. So, thinking beyond the truck isn't really about adding complexity, right? It's about removing silos. Scott, we talked a little bit about who BFC is and what you guys do.
Yeah, so BFC has, as you can see on the screen, about 55% of the low planner volume out there. We have kind of, four of the biggest food service customers, and then we have some small food service customers. So, been around for about 30 years, and BFC also has a WMS called Dakota. So if you don't know much about that, we have a revenue replenishment optimizer. We have some delivery products as well. We didn't really talk about them today, but BFC has a full suite. So now we're going to be that end-to-end WMS all the way out to delivery.
Excellent. And just a little bit about Descartes. We're all about moving the world. We're a global leader in logistics technology. We've helped over 29,000 customers around the globe get things from point A to point B. And we do that in a much smarter, faster, and more efficient way. The pillar that I work in, Fleet Solutions, we have a delivery management platform that really empowers distributors to optimize routes, streamline their dispatch, and then execute daily operations very precisely and with a tremendous amount of confidence. We also want to foster real-time driver and customer engagement. Plus, we need to capture, valuable feedback so we can fuel continuous improvement within every organization. That's Descartes in a nutshell. So I think right now we'll see if there's any questions. I definitely got one that came in from Bailey talking about driver location when Chris was talking about on demand, and the location can be sourced either via a telematics device. We integrate with many, many different third-party providers in North America, as well as across the globe. Or it can be also taken from one of our driver mobile applications, which are all GPS equipped as well.
We do have one other question, Cindy. This will go out to Ben. Does the integration between daily routing and load planning handle real-time warehouse constraints like dock congestion or multi-temp loading sequences?
Yeah, so multi-temp loading sequences, yes. And so that's a core part of that is understanding different temperature zones. And so that for sure. Dock congestion, not necessarily, it doesn't. There's not really a real-time view. Typically, there's a WMS that would be able to support with some of that. But yeah, there's not a dock congestion component to this, unfortunately.
We like to think that the dock is going to be less congested because you have a clearer plan, right? The pallets can be loaded quicker because you're not waiting for something, it can be loaded directly onto the trailer.
Awesome. Denise, do we have any more questions?
I am not seeing any others.
Okay, great. So just as kind of a leave behind for folks, we want to put this QR code up here really quickly. This is a customized landing page that really talks about how Descartes and BFC work together as highly invested partners in each other. We really want to work with folks to make sure that they get better operating ratios and margins. We're passionate about on-time delivery in full. We look at driver retention through multiple lenses to make sure that we're doing the right things at the right time to help organizations retain those drivers. We also want to make sure we're optimizing the people in our organization and how we use them. And of course, the bottom line is really about margin protection and what many of these businesses are low margin businesses. So please scan the QR code, get in touch with us. We would love to hear your comments about the webinar or any other questions you might have.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.